Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program today. My name is Julia Thompson, and I'm the Education Program Manager at the Holocaust Center. I'm happy to be here with Dr. Marie Berry for her presentation on love, resilience, and creativity during genocide and mass atrocities, our first of 3 Lunch and Learns to commemorate Genocide Awareness Month this April. Several weeks ago, the Holocaust Center family lost Tom Lenda, born Tomasz Lustig in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia in 1936, a dear member of our Speakers Bureau for over a decade. Tom was devoted to sharing his story of survival as a child in Terezin. It was a tale of how hatred and bigotry imprisoned him, a child of 6, for no reason other than he was Jewish. Tom's emotional testimonies had great impact on students, leading them to gain a deeper sense of history and their responsibility to take personal action. Tom's daughter, Hannah, began to tell his story as a legacy speaker for the Holocaust Center several years ago as Tom's health declined. We honor Tom and his family and hold close the happy moments shared with him. May Tom's memory be a blessing. Now I'd like to thank the Holocaust Center's community partners for this Lunch and Learn, the Together We Remember Coalition, and Pacific Lutheran University's Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. Special thanks also to the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation for supporting this presentation, and to the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund for being the 2021 Lunch and Learn sponsor. Let's take a moment to acknowledge that the Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle, where I am today, sits on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. The Duwamish continue to honor, practice, and share their heritage and culture, and the center strives to join them in this endeavor. If you are joining from outside Seattle, I encourage you to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the Indigenous peoples of your own town or area. The link to this informative site is in the chat. Now, I am pleased to formally introduce Dr. Marie Berry. Dr. Berry is an associate professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. In her scholarship as a sociologist, Dr. Berry focuses on the impact of genocides and mass atrocities on women, and women's ability in the face of such tragedies to survive and even thrive. She is the author of War, Women, and Power, From Violence to Mobilization in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Dr. Berry is also the director of the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative, an effort to elevate and amplify the work that women activists do around the world. Let's rewind over 15 years, though. In 2005, Dr. Berry was an undergraduate student at the University of Washington and had an internship at none other than the Washington State Holocaust Education Resource Center. Yes, the earlier incarnation of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. She then also worked with the center in her first post-UW job. Dr. Berry's time working with the center and deep bonds she developed with several Holocaust survivors in our community were catalysts for her ensuing career. In her talk today, Dr. Berry will show how human beings have long resisted through solidarity, art, nonviolent direct action, and other creative strategies to reclaim their humanity. These forms of everyday resistance are critical for us to understand and improve our ability to stop genocide and other mass atrocities going forward. We will be taking your questions after Dr. Berry presents, so please add yours to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the hour. Dr. Berry, it is such an honor to have you back with the Holocaust Center community today to share your expertise. So I will hand it over to you to begin.
Thank you so much, Julia. I am truly delighted and honored to be with all of you today, to be able to share some thoughts that I've gathered really over the past 13, 14 years since my time at the Holocaust Center. And I cannot tell many of you how formative my time at the Holocaust Center was for my own career. I think about so many of the survivors that I met, so many of the remarkable people I worked with, and just am grateful to this day of the way in which that experience has really shaped my career. I'm going to share my slides with everybody now. And I want to tell you about where I was sitting just over a year ago in late March 2020. Like many of you, this was a period of tremendous anxiety and fear as the COVID pandemic began to engulf our communities, our families, and our lives. And as I approached the end of the month, I was scheduled to teach a course during spring quarter of 2020 on comparative genocide at the University of Denver. I've taught this course every year since I became a professor 6 years ago. Now, you'll remember with me what it felt like to watch the pandemic spread, to watch the rising body counts of those dead on the nightly news, to hear stories from my own family members fighting for their lives, hearing from my terrified international students who were suddenly facing border closures, being indefinitely separated from their families, hearing how one of my best friends went to deliver her baby in a lower Manhattan hospital that had a refrigerated truck for bodies parked outside. And it was 5 days before the class started that I realized I just couldn't teach it. I couldn't teach a class on comparative genocide at that point in time. And I was demoralized, and I went on Twitter and I said something simple like, I really would rather right now in this moment teach a class on love and creativity, on resilience instead. And all of a sudden, dozens of people started commenting about these themes in the context of great adversity. A dear friend of mine told me of her grandparents who had fallen madly in love in a Polish ghetto during the Holocaust, which they survived and eventually built a beautiful life together in Montreal. Loose acquaintances from my time in Bosnia sent me clips of them as teenagers in theater groups that they were participating in during the war, of art they made. People sent me stories from Guatemala about a women's group who had used art to shame the military and to build solidarity and strength in their own community. I received pictures of murals in Argentina and in Colombia and in Indonesia, murals that gathered a sense of beauty and resistance in the face of profound violence by the state. Now, as more than 100 comments and suggestions rolled in, I realized that in all of my work to date, and in the hundreds of interviews I've conducted with women in Bosnia, Rwanda, Nepal, Uganda, Colombia, and many other places, stories of joy, of humor, of generosity, of creativity, and of resilience have always existed alongside the stories more often told, those of suffering, of loss, or of pain. And indeed, I became more started really reflecting on this idea that two things are simultaneously possible. Destruction and devastation always unfolds alongside beauty and joy. As Rebecca Solnit has said, the word emerge is in the word emergency. As from an emergency, new things come forth. The old certainties are crumbling fast, but danger and possibility are sisters. And I started thinking about the work that so many of us are doing, so many of you in the audience and so many of you watching online. Those of you at the Holocaust Center for Humanity, all of the incredible speakers on the Speakers Bureau, all who seek to advocate for justice and peace in our classrooms, in our churches, our mosques, our synagogues. We share a goal of building a world that is more free for more people. And yet, despite decades of this work, we continue to see mass atrocities unfold in places around the world, from the crisis at our southern border, to the humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, to the solidifying dictatorship in Myanmar, all unfolding as I speak. And I began to think about what we might gain if we centered instead the stories of love, the stories of resilience and creativity during genocide and mass atrocities in our thinking. What new possibilities for advocacy and for change might be possible? I want to tell you a few stories that I've heard from women that I've had the privilege to interview as part of my research on women in war over the past 13 years. And I offer these stories as a way of just illustrating some of the ways in which resilience manifests to help us better understand the inherent power in that concept. I want to tell you about a woman named Linda, who I met in Rwanda in 2013. She grew up in a rural part of the country, but in 1988 moved to Kigali, the capital city, with her husband. She was 31 when the genocide broke out in April 1994, 27 years ago. Because she was Tutsi, Linda fled the city, but her husband, also Tutsi, was killed. Trying to survive, Linda stayed in the bush for several more weeks. There, her muscles atrophied because she was too scared to move, and she lacked food and water. She became too weak to walk. And while she was hiding, genocidaires killed many members of her family and her friends and her neighbors. But Linda survived. She suffers to this day from profound physical disabilities, and she found herself initially alone after the violence. And as she put it to me, when you begin to lose hope because you've lost all of your loved ones and you have nobody to talk to, it becomes very terrifying. But she began to notice people in her area, mostly widows, who came together to console themselves. And as she grew a bit stronger, she began to join them so she could have people to talk to, friends. These human connections were incredibly important for Linda. She had not had too many friends before the violence, but found them all gone in the aftermath. And in these new friends, she found herself in community with people who had also suffered. They began to recognize their shared experiences and in them shared strength, forging what Jan Patočka has called a solidarity of the shaken, a solidarity forged among those who understand intimately what life and death are all about. This solidarity and her community of friends is what keeps Linda going to this day, and she credits it with allowing her to survive. I want to tell you the story of Gita in Nepal. She grew up in a rural town in central Nepal. During the earliest days of the Maoist insurgency, her community was a stronghold for communist ideology. When Gita was 11 years old, the army killed her older brother. As she put it, my parents were not even able to grieve properly for their lost son. It was not allowed. We had to stay behind closed doors so no one would know what was going on. This experience was deeply traumatizing for Gita. She described me and my family members felt like we were forced to smile and laugh outside. We were forced to smile and laugh outside in the community, to pretend like nothing was wrong. There was really no place to cry because we did not want our families and neighbors to know what had happened. A year later, tragically, Gita's teenager sister was also killed by the government. And this set her family into complete trauma and devastation. Two of her siblings found themselves hospitalized for their grief. But Gita found community with other victims. At first, those whose family members had been killed by the Maoists and those who had been killed by the government were separate. They were divided. They were very fearful of each other. But as she put it, there was no atmosphere for these two victim groups to come together and work, so she created one. Through her networks, she began to bring people together that had suffered on different sides of the conflict. They didn't talk politics. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about cooking, what they enjoyed to cook. They found that they all enjoyed singing. They enjoyed singing together. They found that singing helped them release some of their pain. It helped them laugh. They found that they enjoyed art. They enjoyed getting their hands dirty, getting messy, and actually participating in creating things together. She Gita eventually told me, she said, I came to terms with my innocent teenage sister dying and somebody else's innocent teenage sister dying. It was the same thing. We're all humans. And this recognition was powerful. When both sides were able to come together and recognize their shared humanity, she said, we have a stronger voice. I sat down with Charisse, the mayor of a large district in Rwanda, in her office. Charisse described to me how after the genocide in Rwanda, she had 14 orphans in her home to care for. They needed food, clothing, to be held, washed, comforted. She told me how her experience was not unique. Other women were faced with the same thing, raising children from their husband's side and children from their own side. To be able to provide for these children under conditions of widespread insecurity, scarcity, and trauma, Charisse joined with other women in her neighborhood. Their community was built out of both a need for solidarity and a need for survival. And it required them to create safe spaces for the lives of the human beings that were now in their care. They also found themselves safer in community, as after the violence, as Charisse put it, there was no longer a system to protect the women because now the brothers were gone, the husbands were gone. So Charisse and the other women, or the other women in her community who were mothering those that were not their own children, acknowledged that they had to develop a fierce ethic of love to support these children, not one of romantic love, but a fierce love that is required to mother children who were not meant to survive, to raise them with hope in a better future and a better world. Much like in Rwanda, women in Bosnia also took on tremendous responsibilities for caring for children, for elderly, and for others in their community during the war. Women took great risks, seen here, crossing the city under sniper fire just to collect water from the city's only well. And one of the things that struck me in so many of my interviews with women in Bosnia is that they took these perilous journeys across the city in high heels, with lipstick on, trying to preserve some sense of normalcy in their lives. For instance, I met Ismet Durovic, who's currently a member of parliament in Bosnia. And she survived the siege of Sarajevo while working as a public broadcaster at a radio network. Every day during the siege, she painted her nails red, she applied lipstick, pressed a clean white shirt, and put on her high heels. And this act of dressing up, she suggested, helped her maintain her identity and to resist the chaos of war that unfolded around her. It allowed her to secure her own power over what she could. Continuing to work during the siege in as much normalcy as possible gave her motivation to survive. As she put it to me, when you are alive at the end of the day, you feel that you are a human being and you must be useful to yourself and others. Of course, if you can, I found all of this in my work. She described how we sometimes worked 72 hours or 80 hours in a shift because it was impossible for us to leave or for our replacements to come because of violence, because of sniper fire. So she sometimes stayed 3 or 4 days in the radio building in that same clean pressed shirt, working 24 hours at a time and sleeping. But she described this period of time not as one of exhaustion, although it was, of course, that. She described it not as one of tremendous fear, although it was, of course, that too. She described instead how it was a time of wonderful community because we were all in that building together. We were trying to work as normally as possible because we were on one side, the side of humanity, the side of the citizens of Sarajevo, and we were all under siege. This famous image that I show here, taken by Tom Stoddart in Sarajevo, shows that Ismeta's experience was not unique. Women in Sarajevo and across Bosnia often saw beauty and their own appearance as a way of rejecting the violence and the absurdity of war. It was a way of reasserting their humanity. Now, Sarajevo itself was a city of amazing creativity and resilience under siege. And it's worth, if anyone's interested, looking into the stories out of Sarajevo even further. When militaries, for instance, erected barricades throughout the city, preventing people from crossing certain lines or certain streets, women set up satirical counter barricades where they served traditional Bosnian food like cevapcici and burek as a way of saying, this is not our war. An underground art scene emerged. Theater performances, often poking fun at the absurdity of war, were incredibly popular. Susan Sontag, for instance, staged Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot under siege. Others put on a full production of the anti-war musical Hair. It took nearly 4 months of war-interrupted rehearsals before the show was ready to open. Artillery fire repeatedly knocked out electricity in the theater, and many practices and performances were then held by candlelight. But when Hair opened, it was an incredible success. All of the different shows were sold out, and it continued running for many, many weeks. In fact, all told, throughout the 3+ years of the siege of Sarajevo, there were no fewer than 182 plays that opened. They held opening nights in theaters in Sarajevo. Women, of course, played really powerful roles also in some of this kind of satire, including when they took over Miss Sarajevo and hosted instead in a basement a Miss Besieged Sarajevo competition to draw the world's attention to their plight, juxtaposing their beauty and their bodies with their political demands for the world's attention. Bands and other concerts also unfolded in Sarajevo under siege. Famously, Iron Maiden crossed into the city under barricade, under siege in 1994, and held an amazing concert for 1,000 people. Artists created public installations made from cars, from buildings, from other machinery destroyed by the aerial shelling. And a vibrant nightclub scene even flourished, which reflected an escapist attitude common among Sarajevans at the time. People would drink and dance all night long until it seemed safer to go home in the light of morning. I want to tell you one final story from Bosnia, a story of creativity of a man named Jakob Finchy, who some of you may have heard of. Jakob Finchy is the president of the Jewish community in Sarajevo, and his story is truly incredible. When the siege broke out and blockades of the city were implemented by the United Nations and by many other kind of foreign powers, nothing could get in and out of the city easily. And what quickly became apparent was that many of the pharmacies that existed in the city were no longer able to receive supplies. And many Sarajevans were getting very ill because they lacked the proper medicine to maintain their health. Jakob Finchy and the Jewish community in Sarajevo called in their networks in neighboring countries in the United States and Germany and Israel and many other places. And there are incredible stories about what emerged after this. Under the umbrella of an organization called La Benevolencia, Jakob Finchy and many others began to import necessary medicine. And because of their status as the Jewish community, as not aligned with the ethnic logics or the ethno-nationalist logics of the war, they were able to pass through checkpoints that were held by all of the different warring parties and succeed in importing massive quantities of prescriptions into Sarajevo under siege. And they began to distribute this medicine to anyone who needed it. Regardless of ethnicity, of nationality, this La Benevolencia became the biggest pharmacy in the city. Beyond the remarkable power of importing these medicines, there was an incredible kind of creative exchange that happened where, by taking a series of Israeli passports, Jakob Finchy and others were able to relocate 2,500 people. There are about 1,000 of those people were part of the Jewish community in Sarajevo, but another 1,500 people that were relocated were Muslims, were Christians, were Serbs, were Croats. As Jakob Finchy told me in an interview, it didn't matter who they were. If they needed to get out of the city, we helped them. This kind of undercover operation which enabled people who needed to travel to get the necessary documents to leave the city, has been remarkably sort of ill-reported on. And yet there are many stories like this from Sarajevo, where the communities came together to find ways to protect the most vulnerable, to find ways to defend humanity, and to ensure that that they, throughout the entire process, let everybody know that this was not a war of anyone's choosing. This was a war of a very small sort of nationalist few. Now, in Sarajevo today, you can see the legacies of much of this art and creativity that existed during the siege. This is an image of the Sarajevo Roses, which is an art installation that still exists around the city. It's repainted every year. And these roses are red paint painted on areas where there were bombs that fractured the cement, the concrete. And so the areas where you see these shrapnel explosions have been turned and reappropriated into something that is quite beautiful, something that is colorful, and something that also stands in stark reminder of the way in which the kind of very few Sarajevans ever expected the war to happen when it did, and in their own hometown. The war was something that shocked many people, and so these roses serve as a reminder of the way in which war can happen even when we don't expect it. These forms of creativity I also see and have written about in some of my research as a way of re-territorializing spaces that have been associated with tragedy, with pain, with destruction. And many of the women that I spoke with who survived the genocide in Srebrenica, who lost husbands and sons and brothers and fathers in that horrific massacre of more than 8,000 men and boys in 1995. Many of these women have described to me how they've planted roses, they've planted flowers in their houses, and their gardens are full of beautiful flowers and plants. And they describe this not simply as something merely nice to look at, but rather as a way of reclaiming their homes, reclaiming that space as one associated with beauty and of joy and of love, rather than one associated with the brutalities of war and the suffering that they experienced. So all of these stories lead me to ask this question around what possibilities do we gain if we start thinking about a love ethic, or what it means to foreground or to center love in conversations about genocide and mass atrocities? What does it mean if we begin to recenter our advocacy from violence prevention to the cultivation of community, to the cultivation of beauty, of love, and of art, inside war contexts, and perhaps even more critically, every day in our opportunities, in our relationships, in our families, and in the societies in which we live? What are these? What might become possible for building a world that is less prone to violence, that is more free for more people, if we recenter these stories? I came to think about bell Hooks's work. Bell Hooks is an incredible Black feminist scholar who's been writing about love and the political sort of politics and power of love for decades. And Hooks makes this point that I think resonates in any conversation that we have about genocide, about mass atrocities. She says, without an ethic of love shaping the direction of our political vision and our radical aspirations, we are often seduced in one way or the other into continued allegiance to systems of domination, imperialism, sexism, racism, classism. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against that domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. That action is the testimony of love as the practice of freedom. As I was revisiting bell Hooks's work, I was reminded of my time working at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. And every time I tell people about my time, my 3 years that I worked there, one year full-time and 2 years as a volunteer and as an intern, I'm reminded of several of the incredible human beings that I met during that period of time, and what they taught me about the political salience of love and the importance of love that has been slowly integrated into my own politics. And I want to share with you a brief quote, a brief film of the remarkable Eva Tannenbaum Cummings, because she puts it in her own words better than I ever could.
Love is still the best thing to go for in life. And keep working no matter how old you are. You're never too old to learn something new, which I know at my age, I still try learning things as best I can.
Eva's words have shaped so much of my own thinking about how really the most important thing is to recenter the stories of kindness, the stories of falling in love, of loving children that are not your own, of finding ways to build solidarity and community with others who have suffered similar things to yourself, and what collective strength emerges from that solidarity, from that community, is one that I find to be so uplifting in my own thinking about how we better advocate to end genocide and mass atrocities in the future. Of course, the second story that many of you perhaps are familiar with is the story of Klaus Stern and Paula Stern. I won't retell their story, and I know that Paula is still with us. And I think often of my time spent with Klaus, taking him to various speaking events across the Seattle area, and getting to know his story of having that deep sense of knowing that he loved Paula, and that if they were to survive this together, they would reunite in Paula's hometown. Klaus and Paula's story about Klaus spending 3 or more weeks walking and training and finding his way back to Paula after being separated throughout their internment during the Holocaust is one of perseverance and of resilience that I think, again, reminds me of the ways in which love and the possibility for joy exists alongside the devastation, the horror, and the loss that we so often, I think, and necessarily also focus on. So I began not to begin, but to offer to all of you today, what emerges when we can think about those stories of creativity, those stories of strength, stories of the women who have lost their loved ones, who have lost even their children, and who yet find ways to put one foot in front of the other and rebuild their homes, their communities, even their nation, to build a world in which their children can have some sort of hope for the future. What do we get when we begin to embrace and embody that politic in a daily basis, rather than one that only exists under certain conditions, but rather one that we can center more generally? I imagine oftentimes I try to kind of think about in my own teaching what it looks like, what we're really working for together. I teach a lot about human rights. I teach a lot about security. And what does that really mean to advocate for security, to advocate for human rights? And I try to get my students to think about what sort of world they would like to live in. And we're so embedded in the world that we do live in, the institutions that we take for granted, the types of leading, the types of loving, the types of the ways of knowing that we are taught. We are taught since we are, very young. So it's very difficult, I think, to imagine a world that might be free of some of these systems that create harm, that create violence, that create kind of the oppressions that we see too often in the world. And so I think imagining what it would look like to have a world that is more free, a world that is more centered on a love ethic, is one that I find a project or a kind of an exercise that I find to be deeply challenging, but also to be deeply uplifting. I oftentimes think about Adrienne Maree Brown's words, which she offers when she says, our visions, these imaginings of the future, these visions are ropes through the devastation of the present. These visions, these imaginings of a more free, a more safe, a more just world are ways that we can begin to do the work, trying to build trying to prevent violence and to mitigate its long-term effects and harms, But keeping our eye on that vision is one that I think allows us to do that work in a more transformative way. So I just want to thank you all for your attention, and I really look forward to your questions. Please pop some questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box, and I know Julia will be looking through those questions, and we can have a conversation about some of the themes that came up. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marie. That was just so incredible and really inspiring, actually, to think about a different paradigm in how we consider genocide or violence to affect us. I actually wanted to share a comment that came in that was very touching before we get to questions. This is someone named Saba who wrote in, "I'm originally from Pakistan, an activist in exile currently in New York. I can relate so much to what you are sharing. My father is being thrown in prison in Pakistan for empowering his daughters. My father arrested as revenge after my sister fled persecution. It's difficult to enjoy life these days, but we still find ways to keep ourselves going." And she wanted to thank you as well.
Saba, thank you so much for sharing that, Saba. I think that's, as you say, right? It's difficult to enjoy life, and yet we still find ways to keep ourselves going. I think the ways in which we find the ways that we do find to keep ourselves going are so powerful, right? And sometimes it is the importance of physical touch, the ability to connect. Sometimes it's the ability to be creative. Sometimes I remember when finishing my book, I was listening to a radio broadcast on coming from Syria during the war, and it struck me that the person on the radio said, "Before the war, I didn't know my neighbors. I didn't know my neighbors in Syria, and now every time there's shelling, we retreat to the inner corridor, the inner stairwell of our building, and we play games." Doesn't take away the fact that the shelling is ongoing and the fear is so powerful, and yet the community that emerged around the playing of board games, the comforting of children, the trying to protect some level of innocence for children through the playing of games, struck me as something that was so politically substantive. The forging of new networks, the forging of new community, the forging of new kind of ways of prioritizing time as a result of the fear and the devastation that was part of their experience. And I think, yeah, I really, I'm grateful for your comments, Saba. Thank you.
Thanks, Marie. Even though the COVID pandemic is not the same by any means as that war situation, it brings to mind a lot of the ways that neighbors or folks have come together and enjoyed the little things. So that's a very interesting observation. Thank you.
Absolutely.
A question came in from Martin, and they're asking, can you speak to your experiences regarding the differences that seem to exist between individuals who are able to refocus on love and resilience during tragedies versus those individuals who, understandably, seem unable to do so? That's a big question, but yeah, your expertise would be welcomed.
Martin, thank you so much for that question. Actually, that's the question that motivated most of my work. I was very early on, very puzzled by the way in which I saw some people in my own life profoundly affected by violence, and others that had been profoundly affected by violence seemingly emerge unscathed, or with at least an increased kind of determination to build their life in a way that was more more powerful or more kind of safe going forward. And I don't have a good answer for you. I would say that scholars have been thinking about a lot of this. And there's a field of research on post-traumatic stress disorder. And if I should say, really the field of research that's really relevant is on post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is a phenomenon that we see in people that have experienced tremendous adversity, not in all people, but in some people, where there's not only kind of a resilience, but it's like a bouncing forward, like a renewed sense of urgency and commitment in the aftermath of unfathomable tragedies, including some even like personal experiences with diseases like cancer and things like that. And work by Tedeschi and Calhoun on this is really trying to get at the psychology of some of those answers. But I'm a sociologist, and for me, one of the things that I would just say is that I oftentimes see these two things, strength and resilience, and also devastation and suffering occur side by side in the same people. People are so multifaceted. You can have, there's good days and bad days, I think, for a lot of people that have survived tremendous harm. And I oftentimes meet with women who talk about how, say, the genocide in Rwanda catalyzed their kind of political motivation and commitment to building a better community, and created a sense of strength in their own selves. But they also say that this is really difficult and that they're very tired, and that the amount of exhaustion that it takes to kind of be resilient is one that also exists alongside that sort of strength that I focused on today. I think certainly if you look at some of the stories that I've told today, but also in my book and some of the articles that I've written, the stories, the human beings are so incredibly complex, right? We have people like Linda that I met in Rwanda have this sense of purpose and strength because of the solidarity of the shattered that they have developed with other people that are shattered, and yet they or of the shaken, really, to use the kind of the term, but that doesn't take away the fact that they still feel shattered and shaken, right? So thank you for that great question.
Thanks for your response, Marie. Another question came in about COVID and how current times may be relating to your scholarship. Nora says, thank you so very much. I'm wondering how people around the world who have lost so many loved ones to COVID, along with those who continue to struggle with serious health issues, may be able to apply what you have spoken about. How do they emerge from this ongoing emergency?
This is an incredible question. And I don't know, Nora, if you're the Nora Carlson I know, but if you are, that's such a delight. I'm not sure. You know, I think the concept of resilience is one that is really, it's actually challenged social scientists tremendously. The kind of concept of resilience as one that, you know, I think many people have interpreted to be quite neoliberal in the way that it's been taken by international organizations and NGOs, and sort of applied as a, let's cultivate resilience in these people. And the idea can be, you know, these people should bear the weight of what they're undergoing by themselves, and find the strength in themselves, find the strength kind of in their own kind of lives to be able to survive. And I think one of the things that my own research has really emphasized, and that I think relates to the kind of to COVID and to, you know, health crises in general, is that that so much of resilience is actually cultivated in relation to others. It is not an individual exercise. It's cultivated in relationships of kind of loving solidarity to others that have experienced similar harms. It's cultivated in what has been called by several disability justice activists to be care webs, the way in which you know, people that have survived kind of really difficult health challenges are oftentimes cared for in ways that are not recognized as economically sort of salient. This is also, you know, tends to be very gendered labor, although not always. But the way in which people are cared for, you know, people that bring you food, that help you shower, that help you, you know, take care of your children, that help you in all of the way to help drive you to different appointments, right? Some of these things are these care webs that exist around, I think, people that are suffering from illness, from differing abilities, etc. I think really emphasize the way in which this kind of resilience is cultivated through relationships. And I think, I mean, I oftentimes in my work is primarily with women. I mean, I hear often and kind of constantly about the kind of political salience of motherhood or of mothering. So often the experience of mothering is not one of your own biological children, but of your nieces and nephews and friends and kind of, you know, people from your one side of your family. This idea of kind of it takes a village to raise a kiddo, I think, you know, is politically substantive. And again, that so many of the women, I can't kind of overestimate this. And it's complicated as a feminist scholar, I think, sometimes to emphasize motherhood and mothering, but the way in which so many women that I've met with over the years really talk about the kind of the way in which their resilience is at the core about trying to create safety and space for the ability to cultivate life and well-being in other people. And so I don't know, Nora, if that resonates, but I think it's a wonderful question. And certainly the you know, some of these topics of isolation and of the need for community have never been more apparent and stark as we're, you know, in this global pandemic.
Thanks, Marie. I love that notion of a care web. So thank you for bringing that phrase into our minds. I wanted to build off of what you mentioned about motherhood and the way that women and gender is an integral part of your research, because we did have a question about whether you've discovered how women tend to handle these situations as compared to men. And I myself was also wondering, you know, is this preponderance of kind of care and community building between women post-atrocity, is that in part a function of the gender split of victims? I'm just wondering if you can speak to those things a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, I think so. In my work is focused on women. It's focused on the impact of war on women, and so really my sort of core central interest has been on understanding how women that are so often depicted as the victims of war and of genocide and mass atrocities, who are so often kind of depicted as what some scholars have called weeping women wringing hands, right? This idea of women as kind of the flat victim that has had all of this violence directed at them. And my earliest work was really motivated by a recognition that so many of the women I talked to described their experience of survival and experience of surviving genocide and mass atrocities as one that was so much more complex than simply a story of victimhood, pain, and loss. It was also a story of bravery, of power. I remember in a collaborative project that I did with a dear friend, Jess Smith, years ago. We had a kind of an interview with a woman in Bosnia who had experienced sexual trauma during the war. And she had been experiencing, you know, profound sort of psychological distress. And yet in our meeting with her, we were using kind of a photo voice technique at the time that Jess was leading, and it allowed for this woman to find to tell her story of the war and to tell her story of what had happened afterwards. And the story that she told us was one that centered around a picture that was on the wall. And this was a picture, a little tiny picture of a man. It's just like a passport photo. And, you know, at first we were sort of puzzled, like, what story are you telling us? We're talking to you in part because we know that you've suffered something really, you know, really tremendous, this loss. And she said, you know, basically her father was killed during the war. And in the years after the war, she recognized that she did not have a single picture of her father because they had fled their house and their house had been destroyed, all their belongings left behind. And in the years after the war, while she was suffering from this horrific experience of sexual trauma that she you know faced, she one day took buses for hours and got all the way to her hometown because she'd remembered that to open a utility account in Yugoslavia in the 1980s, you needed to have a passport picture on your utility account just to open like your power account or your water account. And she took bus after bus and then walked into the government, kind of the utility municipal office that was staffed by the very same members of Serb militias and paramilitaries that had been responsible for her father's death and her sexual assault. And she demanded that they dig up the file from 1988 that featured that was the date her dad opened the utility account. And she found it after hours of digging, and there was a picture on it, and she took this picture of her father and she framed it and she put it on her wall, and that was the story she wanted to tell us, not the story of her suffering, right? And so to give a super long answer to your question, I think men are often remarkably resilient too, but I haven't focused on their stories in my research. And I think, again, to really think about the way in which resilience is built in relation. Many of the women I've spoken with and met with have also talked about the importance of their fathers being there by their side as they were recovering from things, telling them that they were not to be ashamed of what they had experienced. These relationships between men and women, I think, are also incredibly formative and important.
Thanks, Marie. And we've got some great questions coming in, so I apologize if we can't get to every one of them today. But I want to maybe finish with a last question from Soraya. They wrote, Marie, thank you for this moving talk. Can you talk about how focusing on love, care, and the ordinary moments of the everyday can help us resist the fetishization or spectacularization of violence, which is in itself its own kind of violence?
I love this question so much. I think oftentimes, especially from myself, I'm positioned in the United States as a white American woman who oftentimes reads the news headlines of violence around the globe, and has been, in many ways, I've done a lot of reflecting on how I even came to this type of work in the first place. And it was in part because I just couldn't understand the enormity of the harm and the suffering that had unfolded during my lifetime. I was 10 when the Rwandan genocide happened, and knowing that I was, alive and conscious and actually quite engaged with the world news at the time, it shocked me to my core. And yet, what has really emerged from the kind of work that I've been doing over the past 13 years is the ways in which these kind of, again, extreme examples of violence are oftentimes seen as disconnected from the underlying structures that are producing oppression and atrocities in all sort of levels and variations and scales, if you will. The same sort of militarized structures, the same patriarchal structures, the same kind of racial capitalist structures that are creating inequality and oppression, not only over there and where, kind of can be sensationalized on the news, but in our own country, in which police violence against Black men continues to be a plague that we see taking people's lives far too often, in which mass shootings continue to unfold, in which we see the detention and caging of children, as part of government policy. These are things that are not kind of disconnected from the same sort of reasons why, if we think from a historical sort of perspective, mass atrocities unfold in so many places, like in Bosnia, like in Rwanda. They are connected in the kind of the root systems that are producing many of these harms. And so for me, an attention to the ordinary, to the everyday, to the kind of to the infrapolitics, to use James Scott's word, to this kind of everyday politics of Asif Bayat, the way in which people actually actively sort of resist these systems of oppression doesn't always look like protests in the street. It doesn't always look like kind of massive movements for change. It oftentimes can look as simple as carving out spaces for care and for love in the midst of these systems of tremendous violence that cause so much harm in so many people's lives. So thank you so much, Soraya, for that brilliant question.
Wow, and thank you, Marie and Dr. Berry, for your incredible.
Marie's great.
I want to honor the hard work you did to get that doctor in front of your name as well, though. And thank you for your wonderful answers to the questions. Again, folks, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that came in today, but I want to thank you for your attention. Can
I just give a quick shout out? I'm just so delighted to see so many people from different stages of my life asking questions. And so just to reiterate what a joy it is to come back to the Holocaust Center for Humanity and know how much my time there shaped my own sort of kind of career to this date. And then, yeah, just very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here today with all of you.
Well, thank you. We're honored to have you as well, Marie. And I think we can send you those last few questions to answer if you're open, and we can share them with the folks who asked. But I want to just conclude with a few statements. Of course, to thank you again so much, Dr. Berry, for taking the time to present on these vital topics that have brought up so many thoughts and intersecting ways to ruminate on the topic of genocide, mass atrocity, and the resilience in contending with them. I want to thank the attendees for being here on Zoom. Also, thanks to Michelle Quinones for providing closed captioning. It takes a team to run the Holocaust Center's virtual programs, and a special shout out to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, for your behind the scenes help. And of course, thank you to the Holocaust Center's Executive Director, Dee Simon, for steering the ship, and our whole staff, Alana Cohn-Kennedy, Nicole Bella, Lori Warshall-Cohen, Amanda Davis, Paul Regelbrug, Sydney Draytell, Ellie Selesky, Rick Brewer, Morgan Romero, Katie Lawrence, and our interns Craig Verniest and Devonshire Lockey. Next Tuesday, April 20th at noon, please return for the Holocaust Center's second Lunch and Learn about Genocide Awareness Month, featuring the Multi-Faith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. We will learn about the humanitarian crisis confronting the women of Syria in this 10th year of Syria's brutal civil war. This will include firsthand stories from Ahed Festouk, an activist from Aleppo, who is among the earliest protest organizers and relief workers there. The views, information, or opinions expressed in these programs are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the Holocaust Center for Humanity. A reminder that this program was recorded, and you will be able to find the video on our website starting tomorrow. Stay safe, everyone, and be well. This concludes our program today.